Bienvenidos de nuevo. Procedemos a escuchar nuestro último ponente del día de hoy, Jaír Félix o Jaír Félix, National Geographic Learning Senior ELT Academic Manager for Latin America, has a BA in TEFL from Universidad Autónoma de Sinaloa in Mexico and a postgraduate degree on Teachers Development from the College of St. Mark and St. John in Plymouth, UK. Jaír has been involved in language teaching and teacher training for over 28 years and has conducted workshops on various topics such as lesson planning, discourse analysis for language teachers, action research, educational technologies, and 21st century skills, among others. Jaír also holds a diploma in teaching English for specific purposes and the e-tutoring certificate from the British Council. He is a frequent presenter at ELT conferences throughout Latin America. Bienvenido, Jaír, un gusto tenerte con nosotros y puedes ya iniciar tu presentación.
Thank you very much, Alex. It's great to see you. Long time no see. And thank you all. Thank you, Universidad de Colima, for the invitation. It fills me with joy and pride having the opportunity to be with you once again. And since we only have an hour or a bit less than an hour, and I have lots of thoughts and ideas to share with you, I'll start right away by sharing my screen. And I would love for you to confirm when you get to see it on yours. Fantastic, lovely. And so the main topic of our interaction today is teaching the whole student. The main input that I'm going to try to present to you this morning has nothing to do with the practicalities of teaching English based on systems or skills, for example. I'm not going to be talking about how to teach grammar or how to teach vocabulary, but rather how to consider our student from a more, let's say, humanistic perspective, particularly given the current conditions of the educational system, in which we're all coming back from a lockdown that actually put us all under a lot of stress, and it represented a huge challenge that for some people is still in the process of being overcome. So we gotta pay a lot of attention to not only the language abilities that we're trying for our students to develop further in our instructional process, but we also need to pay attention to the emotional well-being of our students, and why not say it, our own emotional well-being as English language teaching professionals. And so that's what we're going to be talking about today, teaching the whole student. And yes, the center of our discussion today will, of course, be the student, but let's begin with the counterpart of students in a classroom, which is us, teachers. And even though because of the difficulties of virtual interaction, I'm not expecting to get a lot of answers from you. I want you to make this more of a reflection opportunity. Why did you become a teacher? And I want you to take a few seconds to take a trip down the memory lane and start thinking, what was the main reason I originally decided to become a teacher? If you're a seasoned, experienced teacher, maybe your trip, it's going to take you years back to that point in which you made a decision of becoming a teacher. If you're studying to become a teacher, then why is it that you made such decision? What were the factors that you considered essential in your decision-making process for wanting to become a teacher? And maybe you have very, again, at some point even utopical ideas, or maybe you have very practical ideas. And I'm gonna share a few of those ideas that I've collected by means of asking this very same question to hundreds of teachers around Latin America over the past 2 years. And as I mentioned before, some of the answers that I've collected are very practical answers. Like, for example, I've had teachers that have told me, well, one of the main reasons I considered in my decision-making process is that being a teacher would grant me holidays that are much longer than any other occupation. So the main reason why I decided to become a teacher, it's because of the long holidays. Or some others told me, well, you know what? Yeah, I love teaching and I have the calling, but it's also in practical matters that I'm working for the government, and that means that I'm going to have a pension when I get retired. That could be another reason. Job security. For some teachers, having a secure job is essential, and that's the main reason why they decided to become teachers in the first place. But there were not all just those practical matters. I got hundreds of replies to my question that went more into a rather humanistic aspect of being a teacher, including because I wanted to work with young people, because I wanted to contribute to society, because I loved English. I love the subject. In our case in particular, I loved English. I've always enjoyed learning foreign languages, and I wanted to transmit that to newer generations. But by far, the most widely provided answer to my question has been because I wanted to make a difference to children's lives. And by children, let's not restrict this to an age range, because for teachers, even if you're teaching at college, at university, at postgraduate degrees, your students will always be your children, right? So let's not just take this literally as teaching young learners, but you could change that into my students' lives, because I wanted to make a difference to students' lives. And this has been by far the most popular answer I've got. And that got me thinking. That means that for a lot of us teachers, there's a very powerful humanistic aspect in the interaction that we try to put into practice in our classrooms. So I started researching on the topic, and I came across this research published a few years ago by the Utah Education Policy Center in the US, that stated that 93% of teachers interviewed stated exactly that same reason. For 93% of interviewed teachers, the main reason for wanting to become a professional educator is making a difference to pupils' lives. And you see on that same range that they thought they would be good at it, or they had a lot of interest in the subject area, in our case, English, or they wanted to make a difference to society, or, sorry, they had the desire, to work with young people. But as you can see here, there's a lot of very important humanistic factors that made us decide to become language teachers in the first place. So there we were, first day of school at our first job, getting into our classroom with all those fantastic wishes and desires and drives in our plans. Remember that first day that you started teaching, or those reasons that you used for deciding to become a teacher. And there we were, all shiny, all enlightened with the idea of, I'm gonna teach because I want to make a difference to my students' lives. And then you started teaching, and all of a sudden you started to feel different sorts of pressures, if you may, that affected your everyday performance as a teacher. What sort of factors actually affect the way in which you perform in front of your students in class? Well, number one, your students' expectations. So maybe the reason why you decided to become a teacher is because you want to make a difference on your students' lives. But what if your students are not in the, let's say, disposition of being affected positively by your job? What if their expectations are completely different? The only reason I'm here is because I need to pass this course in order to get my certificate, for example. And so the expectations that brought your students into your class have little to do with your own original desires of making a difference to your students' lives. And that in itself, it's a bit of an issue in terms of what will happen in the classroom. And then on top of that, if you're teaching younger children, if you're teaching at an elementary school level or a secondary school level, it's not only your students' expectations, but it's also your students' parents' expectations. What is it that they expect for you to do? And in which way they expect for you to teach their kids? And that also affects your original desire of making a difference to your students' lives. Or perhaps if you're teaching, let's say, at a college level, at a university level, what about your students' future employers' expectations? Maybe you're trying to teach general English and your students' future employers expect for them to have technical language, for example. And that again affects the original plans, the original wishes and desires you had in mind when you decided to become a teacher. And then there's the school's expectations. And if you're teaching at a public system, there's the government's expectations as well. So there's a lot of different factors that affect the way in which you originally planned to teach. And then on top of everything, nowadays, we also had to experience a lockdown. And we needed to shift from in-person teaching to virtual teaching overnight. And then now we're in the process of reconnecting in person with our students. And that in itself affects greatly what we do and the original desire we had. So when you had to face all of this on daily basis, the original plan you had on making a difference to your students' lives, into your students' lives, gets perhaps a bit blurry on daily basis. And it all starts to vanish, to fade off, and you have to concentrate on the program you got to teach and your school's expectations and the government's expectations and your students' expectations and your own desires get at the bottom of the list. But guess what? Because of the times we're experiencing right now, there's an urgent need to pay attention to those original ideas we had. Going back to reconnecting with the original desires you have for becoming a teacher. And what we're gonna do now is try to analyze 3 ways to encourage positivity, develop soft skills, and deal with difficult situations when teaching in the classroom. What is it that we need to do in order to, at the same time, we are teaching the grammar, the vocabulary, the skills and systems that the program demands. And at the same time, we're trying to cater to the expectations that our students and our parents and our schools have in regards of our daily performance. What can we do to, on top of all that, still manage to make a difference on our students' lives? How can we encourage positivity as language teachers in our classrooms? What is it that we could do in order to help our students develop not only language skills, but also soft skills as they learn and practice English with us? How can we teach our students to deal with difficult situations as part of our daily English language teaching? So those are the three main aspects that we're going to concentrate on in the next few minutes. And let's start with the first of these three bullets, which is 3 ways to encourage positivity. And I want you to start thinking about one very important concept. What makes you feel positive? What makes you feel happy? What puts a smile on your face? I've asked this question at the beginning of the course to my own students. And the answers I've got sometimes have little to do with my plans or the content that I'm about to teach. But it's always, always important to pay attention to those needs and those desires that they bring into class. So I've asked my students, what makes you feel positive? What puts a smile on your face? And I made a cloud. As you see on the screen right now, I managed to make a cloud out of the words that they've given me. Like, for example, my students told me, I love painting. Whenever I have the opportunity to do some artwork, that puts a smile on my face. That makes me feel positive. I like connecting with friends, going on walks, doing craft activities. I love exercising, and that makes me feel positive. I love animals. I love cats and rabbits and dogs. I love music. I love fresh air. Whenever I have the chance to do things outdoor, that makes me feel positive. That puts a smile on my face. So paying attention to those particular ideas that my students presented to me, I could insert some of these aspects into my daily lesson plan. So my lesson plan, it's not only about the grammar or the vocabulary or the reading skill or the writing skill that my students need to develop further in English. My lesson plan also includes a little tiny activity every now and then that would make my students feel positive. Going on walks, connecting with friends, doing craft activities, talking about animals, listening to music, watching a music video, etc., etc. Something that perhaps has little to do with the mechanical aspects of your program, but that has everything to do with teaching your whole student, considering your students as human beings that are not there just simply passively receiving language from you, but rather that are developing not only as language users, but as human beings as part of your course, right? So what is it that I've done in order to make my students feel positive? Number one, I've always asked my students to stay connected. I did this during the pandemic when I was teaching virtually exclusively. But now that we're back in the classroom, I'm always asking my students never to forget their friends, even if they're not in the same class. They've already developed friendships and relationships that are perhaps worth including as part of their learning process. So how about every now and then, and depending on the topic, depending on the content of your class, how about giving your students tasks or assignments, homeworks like this? So I'm going to ask you to contact 3 friends or 3 family members and ask them to tell you an interesting fact about themselves. Or ask them to think of 3 adjectives to describe you. Or ask them to tell you about a time when they felt scared or excited or proud. Or ask your friends to tell you what their last meal would be. Or describe a friend of theirs whom you've never met. Or tell you about a time when they made a mistake. So even if you want to insert a grammatical structure, a vocabulary field, you could. And in that way, you are pretty much helping them practice the language further, but at the same time, you're helping them connect with their own friends, with their own family members in an activity that it's not the usual everyday sort of interaction they would have with them. And through that, you are making them feel a bit more positive as a whole, and also a bit more positive in relation to your own class. Okay, that's just an idea. Another thing we could do is, whenever possible, ask your students to get outside, even if they're just sticking their head out of the window in your classroom. So whenever possible, I ask my students to do things that involve going outdoors. So a lot of the projects that I use with my students, no matter the age, involve leaving the room and do something out there in nature. So for example, it could be go outside and take a picture for every color in the rainbow. Let's say you're teaching children or teens basic language. That's why you only have one little dot here, because this is a basic English activity. So go outside and take a picture for every color in the rainbow, and then bring those photos to class and challenge a partner to name the colors. If you're teaching a more intermediate level of English, how about challenging your students to go outside and take a picture for every letter of the alphabet, if you're practicing the alphabet, for example, and then have a partner or have the rest of the class guess the words. Or if you're teaching a more advanced level, have them go outside and take a picture to represent a colloquial phrase. For example, every cloud has a silver lining. So I give them phrases in English, and I want them to capture an image that represents that phrase, and then bring the image to class and have the rest of the class guess the phrase that's represented in the image. We're practicing the language further, but more importantly, I'm challenging my students to go outside, to get in touch with nature, because in that way, they are triggering the possibility of feeling more positive. And remember, we are trying to encourage positivity here, right? And so we say staying connected as one particular way for developing positiveness in your class, getting outside as the second way for triggering positiveness in your class, and the third one would be challenge them to create something. Challenge your students to go with the flow. Move away from the idea that your students are passive recipients of language. They could be active developers of language and content, given the right conditions, given the right input. So allow for students to be active developers of language and content in class. Challenge them to go with the flow, to create something. What do I mean by this? Well, everyone dreams of having more free time. But according to psychologist Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, people are actually happier when they're busy, as long as they're doing something challenging. And that's the key word. As long as they're doing something challenging. Csikszentmihalyi invented the term flow for the pleasant experience of having enough interesting things to do that you don't notice time passing. Doing nothing, on the other hand, makes us feel bored, guilty, and depressed. So since we're talking about encouraging positiveness in your class, the secret recipe for that perhaps is provide your students with a lot of different activities, never allowing for them to feel bored in your class, guilty at some point of being there instead of being somewhere else, or pretty much depressed on, I'm wasting my time here, I'm learning nothing, this is very boring, etc., etc., right? So challenge your students to go with the flow. Challenge your students to do something that is engaging enough so that they don't feel, that they don't notice time passing. Some crazy ideas that I put into practice with my own students. For example, I've challenged my students to write a story which includes the words piano, tree, and banana. 3 random words that on surface have nothing to do with each other. But the challenge them is write a story that includes the 3 words in a coherent, cohesive way. Or I've challenged them to find a healthy recipe in English which uses a cabbage, a pepper, and some cheese. And they use their phones and they start, searching for recipes with such ingredients. And then I challenge them to change some of the ingredients and make their own version, to write the recipe, and perhaps even get to take a photograph explaining why that recipe is healthy. Or at a more basic level, drawing a picture of something you love. Could be a person, a pet, a possession, a view, and then writing a few short sentences to say why you love that person, or why you love that pet, or why you love that possession or that view, etc., etc. But notice how we're always involving students in active activities, if you know what I mean. We're not just simply considering them passive recipients of language. We're challenging them to do something that will not just practice the language further, but it will also trigger positiveness in them because you get them in the flow. Okay, so we've seen 3 ways for triggering positiveness, right? The first one was staying connected, making students get in touch with their important persons by asking them questions, interviewing them, and making them part of the learning process. The second tip was getting outside, challenging students to do activities outdoors. And the third one is getting students go with the flow. Stop considering them passive recipients of language and make them active developers of new language, of new content. 3 ideas for developing positiveness further in the class. Okay. Now, our second point was 3 ways to develop soft skills. Skills that are being labeled as extremely necessary, even essential for reaching success in 21st century endeavors. Nowadays, our students no longer just need to learn how to read and write and speak and listen in English, which are the traditional language skills. Alongside those language skills, they also need to develop soft skills, 21st century skills. The first one of them being teamwork, making our students understand that many hands make light work. And maybe you can say, well, I've always asked my students to work in pairs or to work in teams, but it never seems to work well. They always end up talking in Spanish a lot. They don't get along. They can never reach agreement on how to do stuff. And it is sometimes backfiring at me, right? And perhaps the issue lies on the fact that your students are not aware of the importance of teamwork and collaboration. And perhaps we've never taken the time to give them examples and ideas on how to successfully work in teams. So after you ask your students to get in teams, present them with potential paths that they could follow in order to make that activity a success. Take the time to present your students with a chart like this, for example, how to work in a team. Perhaps they're not even aware of what's needed in order for teamwork, for collaborative work to be a success. Talk about the importance of being reliable. Talk about the importance of doing their own share and support others. Tell them about the importance of listening to others, and also get the risk of expressing their own ideas. And most importantly, tell them that a key factor for reaching success in teamwork is respect, respecting other people. So being reliable, doing your share, supporting team members, listening to others, communicating their ideas, and respecting other people are the essential factors for collaborative efforts to, reach success. Have you ever taken the time to make your students aware of such factors? If the answer is yes, beautiful. If the answer is no, no biggies. Perhaps you can start tomorrow. And maybe you can process this yourselves. If you're students right now, think about the potential of following this set of ideas in order to make your collaborative efforts more fruitful and more successful, right? Present your students with, tips and ideas on how to make teamwork, collaborative efforts more successful. Tell them, for example, that it's important to have confidence in themselves, that we're all in agreement that it can be difficult to work in a team, particularly if you're very quiet, if you're very shy, if you're not very confident on your own ideas. But guess what? Teams should always respect you. And so you don't need to be afraid of sharing your ideas. You got to learn to have confidence in your opinion. And the more you present your students with those tips and those ideas, the bigger the chances for them to feel more engaged in collaborative efforts. And so you present students with projects that allowed for them to work in teams in a successful way. And if possible, presenting them with options. So instead of imposing a single project to all the class, what about giving them choices? So depending on your own, emotional state, depending on your own abilities, depending on your own skills, you can decide whether to work on project 1 or project 2. But that is a decision that you have to take, including the rest of your team members. So showing students how to work in a team is essential for them to develop that collaborative skill that is so necessary to reach success in 21st century endeavors. And that is the first aspect, the first soft skill that we need to target in our practice, giving students the notions necessary to develop collaborative efforts successfully. The second one has to do with resilience and telling our students to just keep swimming. What do I mean by this? What do I mean by telling our students to just keep swimming? Let's take a look at this video and in order to fully understand that phrase.
Está temblando, salgan todos en orden, por favor.